All right. Hello, everybody. It's time to get to chapter 15 of Locke's second treatise of government. So, this chapter is titled Of Paternal, Political, and Despotical Power Considered Together. And Locke has covered most of these kind of individually earlier on, but here he's going to go through and kind of go hit them one at a time in sequence, in close proximity, and then kind of make comparisons and contrasts between them. And there's going to be one really important point here that I think is worth remembering about this chapter in particular regarding the differences between these three powers. So, starts out paternal or parental power. It governs those who lack reason but are expected to have it until, at some point in the future. Children, effectively. And the purpose of it is to guard them and their property and their lives and their, intelligence until it develops the ability to understand the laws of reason. It is exercised for the good of the child. It is not severe or arbitrary, but for, quote, help, instruction, and preservation. It's worth noting that different cultures might have different conceptions of what defines severe as far as child rearing goes. Locke doesn't really mention it too much, but he was a, 17th century Englishman, so at least that level of strictness is permissible. He continues by noting that paternal or parental power does not beget permanent subjection, but does oblige respect, quote, respect, honor, gratitude, assistance, and support over a child's life. Basically, it is something that is given without requirement of recompense by the child, but that, social norms being what they are, generally speaking, the ideal would be that the parent is good to the child, and then later on the child is good to the parent. This kind of forms a natural circle, right where the child is taken care of, and then the child takes care of the parent. We hear this a lot from like social conservatives and stuff like that. So this is pretty well understood. And then the final point Locke makes about paternal or parental power is that it does not reach to life and death, or to property. That is, if someone gives a child something, say a trust, right? The parent doesn't have the right to squander that, but must kind of keep it in good, in reasonably good standing until the child is old enough to have the power to have the reason to manage it himself or herself. Moving on, Locke then talks a little bit about political power. He notes that political power is achieved by compact and consent. However, recall that we were concerned earlier about Locke's sense of consent. It seems to involve a decent amount of implied consent here and there. It's tied to location with the concept of dominion that Locke uses. And there's some level of majoritarian or implied consent that's implied by Locke's system, as well as, and this is the other thing that is worrisome, is the non-retractability of consent in Locke's system. At least so far. We're going to talk about like, revolution and conquest and stuff in the next few chapters. But so far, Locke has not really given us most, particularly good justification for people saying, well, this system is no longer providing me a benefit, therefore I need to get out. And that's something that I think is way more, it deserves a lot more attention than Locke is giving it. Hopefully we'll get something useful from that in the later chapters, but, we'll have to see. So, to continue with a summary of Locke here, man gives up power to society. He has all these powers in the state of nature, and he gives some of them up, for instance, the ability to judge conflicts involving himself, things like that. And the political power, that is properly understood political power, must be employed for the good of the people. Now, we of course have poked at this a lot because good of the people language is vague enough that it can be used in a very paternalistic tyranny to basically treat everyone as if they were children and that the state is the parent with parental power. That results in because the parental power involves temporary like stewardship of property, and if the state is the temporary steward of everyone's property, then, well, it can do a lot of things with that. Locke repeats that political power cannot extend beyond the powers bestowed by nature. This is one of those things where, again, we've mentioned this before, but the rules and laws of nature are not perfectly known. Locke gives us a couple of them. He refers us to Richard Hooker for several other ones, but it's worth noting that there's the possibility of good faith arguments and disagreements about what the laws of nature are, and in fact, we expect that to happen. But there's an initial point to worry about here, is that Locke has already admitted that there are some needs for practical laws. He's talked about taxation, for instance, and saying, well, if we're going to spend all these resources, protecting everyone's rights, then everybody has to pay for it. And this is one of those things where there isn't any power to tax in the state of nature, right? There's the power to offer a service and then receive and do so for an agreed upon payment, and to expect payment of that on the way back. But the state doesn't operate that way in general, right? Even a Lockean state, the majority makes decisions, and the minority may find that it disagrees with some of these decisions and may not wish to pay for them. Let's say that the majority decides to expand a road system or something, and there's a minority that says, no, that's not a good use of our funding. Well, the state can then demand from them payment for a service that they're not asking for. This is not something that, strictly speaking, is within the state of nature. This is kind of a situation where implied consent and like non-retractability of consent are kind of working together to create minorities that are exploited in this system, right? Or at least could be. And so we do have to watch out for that. Continuing with the summary. Political power, quote, the purpose of political power is, quote, to quote, preserve the members of that society in their lives, liberties, and possessions. Now this at least provides us with a scope for government action, but again, possessions requires a theory of property. Locke gave us a basic theory of property, but that theory of property, he admits, doesn't quite continue once society is actually formed. He talked about, homesteading things in the state of nature, but in reality, he argued that that once a person enters a society, some of those rights of property are going to be given up. And he's not clear. And in fact, you could expect different governments to come to disagreements about what the exact theory of property needs to be once the society is formed. And of course, taxation is another issue with this, right? Because one might say, well, we should take from everyone's property equally because they're all getting equal defense. Or, you could have a graduated income tax, things like that. There's all kinds of different ways to do this. And, some of them are a little bit more, fair than others, depending on what your perspective is. Locke repeats, again, that the political power is not absolute, arbitrary power over lives and fortunes. Lives and fortunes, Locke says, must be preserved, quote, as much as possible. Now, this is one of those things where he's using fuzzy language because if the assumption is that the state must necessarily be as efficient as possible, that's a standard that will never be reached, which means that every state is there by definition, illegitimate because it's being imperfectly efficient. This is not what Locke, I think, is trying to get across with this. And so he's using flowery language to his own detriment, which I think is something that you have to watch out for, especially when you're making philosophical arguments like this. Vague language or extreme language, as much as possible, results in arguments falling flat where they could be worded more carefully and actually hold up to counter-argument. Locke repeats that the political power that what it does is it makes laws and annexes penalties to the violation of those laws, and here's the real kicker is that political power is achieved through compact, through agreement, through mutual consent, and this is kind of the I think the meat of this chapter is that Locke is describing where these three powers come from. And this is, I think, the first time he's done this so clearly. So the paternal power, the parental power, is a natural power. It comes from the law of nature, because a parent, by the fact of having a child, is obligated to protect, educate, and keep that child, in trust until the child is capable of operating under its own reason. Political power is achieved only by compact agreement and mutual consent. Any power that mimics political power that is not achieved by compact agreement or mutual consent is despotic power, despotical power, as Locke puts it. And we're going to get to that next. Despotical power is absolute arbitrary power one man has over another. It is the power to decide life and death for someone. It is not a power that is given by nature, and it is not a power that is made by mutual agreement. It is a power that is made by domination. Locke reminds us that there's no clear distinction between men to describe just by looking at someone whether he's a member of the owner class or the slave class. There is no such clear distinction among mankind, and therefore we can't rely on that kind of thing to decide who is worthy of being dominated over by despotical power. Locke notes that no compact can lawfully, according to the law of nature, convey despotical power to another, because a man does not have a right to kill himself under Locke's framework. This is something we've seen before. This derivation comes theologically, and so in modern times we need to be more hesitant to use theological arguments, and so this is a potential place where someone arguing against this could get in a wedge by saying, well, Locke said that there's no right to suicide only because Locke was, a Christian, yada, yada, yada. We no longer recognize that limitation on your rights, therefore, blah, 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 blah. So this is something to kind of watch out and to think about, because what it does is if we allow for a person to sign over his own life, there's a bunch of possible issues that come from that, not the least of which being that it creates confusion between political and despotical power. And of course, despots love that confusion between proper Lockean political power that is made by consent, and despotical power over you. Despotical power in Locke's system is only held by the defensive victors of a just war over the vanquished. So the situation is basically this. Group A attacks unjustly Group B. Group B defends itself and wins. If Group B wins, then the members of Group A become the slaves, the slaves of Group B, the just defensive victors. It's worth noting that there are other potential outcomes to this kind of conquest situation. Locke's going to talk about that in a later chapter called On Conquest. In fact, I think that's the next chapter of Conquest, yeah. It's worth noting that in Locke's system that if there are offensive victors of unjust wars, that they are criminals in the state of nature or the state of war with respect to all others, right? So Locke deals with the other possible outcome of a war, but he does it in kind of a very subtle way that he doesn't talk about it that much here. Still, moving on. Locke says that aggressors by nature of their aggression, have given up the rights of the law of nature, the right to respect of their autonomy. They've classified themselves as, quote, a wild beast or, quote, a noxious brute. He uses those specific phrases. And an aggressor, in the state of nature, in the primeval state, an aggressor is someone that can always be attacked, whether he has aggressed against you specifically, or whether someone has convinced you that he was aggressed against him. That's one of the problems with the state of nature, is that someone can unjustly, and using lies, convince you that someone is an aggressor and cause you to pit your force against them without a just cause, right? This is why we want a society where laws are known. This is why we want a society where judges are well known, well respected, and impartial, right? This is why we don't want to have people judging their own things, because they have a tendency to exhibit bias in that case. That's why we want these agreements for people to abide by the judgment of an arbitrator before the event happens, because then we can say, well, you agreed to this, and this is the arbitrator, and you agreed to abide by this, and so now we can actually express a property right in the stuff that you are holding, because you have agreed to pay it over previously to the event. This is one of the great innovations of the Lockean system, in my opinion. So, finishing up with despotical power. A master of someone who has forfeited his life by way of aggression, that despotical power can be relinquished by the master, by forgiveness or by agreement. Basically, it's worth noting here that despotical power is not the same thing as tyrannical power in Locke's system. I kind of made a mistake a little earlier here, but by kind of saying, well, despotical power is the bad power, but despotical power is not really the bad power in Locke's system. Despotical power, to be more clear, is the power that good people have over bad people once they have been brought to heel, basically. So, here's the real meat of this chapter. And the meat to this chapter is that we can determine what power we're dealing with. For any given power, for any given exercise of power, we can determine what kind of power we're dealing with based on where it came from. And then refer that to the purposes of those powers and see if it's actually a power or not. So, paternal power, parental power, is bestowed by nature, by the virtue of someone being your child. You have obligated yourself to protect him or her until he or she reaches majority, right? Political power is always derived from consent. If a power is not derived from consent, then it's not a political power. And therefore, if consent is not present, then we're also not dealing with true or proper political power. We're dealing with some kind of despotism or tyranny or something like that. Despotical power, is given by forfeiture. This person has not agreed to be the subject of despotical power. They have forfeited their rights to their own choices by being an aggressor and then being defeated in a defensive just war. This is one of those things where Locke has given us 3 classifications and they don't quite fill all of the possibilities, because the natural idea is to say, well, despotical power is the bad one. That's what tyrants use. But the person who submits to a tyrant is not necessarily forfeiting their rights. And the despotic power in Locke's terminology can be a positive thing when you're dealing with aggressors, basically. That by putting them under despotical power, you curb their ability to continue aggressing and harming innocent people. The other thing worth noting is that the paternal power, it is for those incapable of managing property, Locke notes. Let me see if I can find this here. Yeah, right at the end of the chapter. Paternal power is only where minority makes the child incapable to manage his property. Political, where men have property at their disposal, or in their own disposal, and despotical, over such as have no property at all. So again, the person who's lost the just war, right, gives up all of his property, gives up the right to life or death over himself because of his aggression. But it's also worth noting that that the three different types of power involve property in different ways. That paternal power is between someone who has majority, has property, over someone who is not yet ready to exercise power over his own property. Political power is between different people who legitimately own property. And despotic power is a power of those who own property over those who have forfeited the right to property and to their own lives. So that is chapter 15. I don't have too much else to say about this chapter, other than that to watch out for the mistake of assuming that despotical power is always a bad power in a Lockean framework. We use the word despot today in a very negative connotation term, but in Locke's writings here, he's not as negative about it as you might think, because he's not lumping it in with the tyranny of an aggressor or someone against someone who is being like blackmailed into pretending to consent, something like that. So let's finish up here. This has been chapter 15. Next up is chapter 16 of Conquest, and that's a long one. We're probably going to cover that one as one big chapter. After that is chapter 17 of Usurpation, followed by chapter 18 of Tyranny, chapter 19 of the Dissolution of Government, and that might be it. Yeah, after that, that is the last chapter. So we're getting close to the end here. And we're finally getting to the points where Locke is kind of grappling with the more difficult ideas. And by more difficult, I also mean more applicable today, because we're dealing with a lot of tyrannical power, for which I think it is reasonable to argue that proper consent has not been achieved. Anyway, that's all I've got for you on Locke this week. I'm planning on possibly putting together another video this week, but I'm still working on finishing up my novel, so it's going to depend on how much time I can cut away from that. So that's what I've got as far as Locke goes this week. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good week yourself. And I will see you next time when we will cover something, depending on when it happens. Next week we'll be covering of Conquest, but maybe we'll have something else this week. We'll see. Anyway, have a good one, and I'll see you later. I keep saying that. Later.